This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 313 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I feel like I put myself out there with this 15 transactions episode each week, because I'm not just talking about the waiver wire or players to add to your roster. That's looking only at the positives. Negativity bias doesn't exist when you're saying good things about players. What's tough about this episode each week is talking about players to sell. Because when you, a fantasy manager, take that advice and actually trade away that player, it's a punch in the gut when that player then performs. And you remember those moments more. And it's then traced back to me, the person who gave that advice. Today's episode has more sell candidates than usual. And just to be real with you, it makes me a little nervous for that very reason. I want you guys to win. But then to make things worse, this week's episode features sell candidates that I've talked about before. So not only could I sink your fantasy team with my advice, but I'm essentially doubling down on some players. That just invites the haters. Now, people may view that as me being stubborn, but I consciously try to not be an analyst with take lock. It's a very big deal to me. I really don't care, or I try not to care, if my opinions change on players with new information. I care more about being informative and objective with my analysis. I care more about the process. So remember that as you listen to today's show. I promise I don't hate players. I'm trying to use the information I have to be helpful. I'm not trying to lock into a take that I had in September just to say I told you so. That's got to be the dumbest way to do things. But before getting into this week's transactions, I wanted to send another reminder to you guys to check out OddsFire. It's an odds comparison that NumberFire's engineers developed, and it's the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers in the regulated U.S. market. Compare odds, quickly identify the best value, and even examine first-party FanDuel data all in one place. Never settle, always get the best odds. Check out the experience for free now on NumberFire or at oddsfire.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Sell Derrick Henry. Yeah, I know, guys. I talked about Derrick Henry last week on this show, and Derrick Henry went absolutely nuts against the Chiefs. Now, to be fair, I did say the following in my 15 transactions column last week. I said, it should be noted that Tennessee gets Kansas City this week, creating a good matchup for Henry on paper. If you want to wait to sell him, it's understandable, but Henry's value also will diminish if he doesn't perform. So hopefully you waited, because Henry finished the week with 33 fantasy points. That gave him his third top 10 performance in his last 4 games. I know a lot of you are probably saying this is when Derrick Henry really pays off. Maybe that's true, but I don't buy into narratives like that. I think those narratives get you into trouble more often than they don't. The truth is, Henry's continued to outperform in the touchdown column even more than he has historically. As we all know, touchdowns correlate strongly to yards. The more yards a player has, the more touchdowns he usually scores. Now, context is always needed with that type of analysis, but Henry's yardage total tells us that he should have 3.4 fewer touchdowns than he currently has. Now, speaking of that context, players in good offenses can outplay the simple yards to touchdowns conversion. But let's not pretend that Tennessee has this great offense. They've scored 30 or more points just twice this year, and even when you only look at games that Ryan Tannehill has started, the Titans have been completely average in yards per drive. And that includes Sunday's performance where they looked decent against Kansas City. And as I mentioned last week, Derrick Henry is not even seeing that many high leverage touches. Through week 10, he's had 6 goal line rushes. That ranks outside the top 20 in the league. And then to top it all off, we know he's not involved that much as a receiver. He's hit a single game target share of 10% or better only twice this season. Now, the Titans have a bye this week, so if you need to win now, Derrick Henry is a good sell candidate. But I think he is even if you need to win later as well, because in the fantasy playoffs, as I mentioned last week, they get Houston and New Orleans. That's in weeks 15 and 16. Those are 2 tough matchups for an opposing running back. Add J.D. McKissic. The Lions lost Ty Johnson to a concussion on Sunday. That allowed McKissic to play more snaps than usual. He ended week 10 with about a 70% snap rate, which was by far the most on that team. And he also led the team in carries. And then he had a 16% target share, which yielded 7 targets. Now, he's not a running back who's likely to get a ton of early down work. But if Ty Johnson misses time, McKissick could be viable as a flex option in PPR formats. Buy D.D. Westbrook. Now, I talked about this a little bit on the mailbag episode last week, but some of you were a little concerned about how the Jacksonville offense would function for Nick Foles and what that meant for the pass catchers on that team. But the thing is, it's not like the Jags had this powerhouse offense with Gardner Minshew under center. On the season, Jacksonville's just slightly above average in yards per drive, and they rank 19th in scoring rate per drive. And I think that with Nick Foles back, we could see a little bit more love for D.D. Westbrook. D.D. Westbrook played one preseason game this year. In that game, he saw 7 targets, and it was with Nick Foles under center. Now, that might not matter at all. That could be completely irrelevant. But at the very least, I think that we should feel good about D.D. Westbrook with Nick Foles under center. I don't think it's going to get any worse. But then on top of that, like I talked about last week with DJ Chark, look at the Jaguars' fantasy playoff schedule. In Week 15, they get Oakland, and Week 16, they get Atlanta. Those are 2 teams that have been very, very friendly against opposing wide receivers this year. They've allowed the 3rd most and the 6th most fantasy points, respectively, to the position. Buy Leonard Fournette. So because the Jags are probably going to be able to move the ball better in those Week 15 and 16 contests against Oakland and Atlanta, that means Leonard Fournette could see more scoring opportunities. And as we know, that's a big deal for Leonard Fournette because he's only found the end zone once this season. Fournette's yardage totals, he has 831 rushing yards and 295 receiving yards. Those yardage totals have historically yielded 7.2 touchdowns for a running back when you look at data over the last 5 years. That's 6.2 more than what Leonard Fournette currently has. From a yards to touchdowns conversion standpoint, Leonard Fournette is the biggest positive regression candidate in the NFL right now. But as we know, like I just talked about with D.D. Westbrook, the Jags offense isn't anything special. So as a result, they rank 30th in goal line plays run this year. So that has hurt Fournette's touchdown potential. So maybe he shouldn't have 6.2 more, but he should definitely have more touchdowns. And the thing is, with Nick Foles under center now, he's a little bit easier to buy because there's this ambiguity as to what if Nick Foles is a lot better than Gardner Minshew? What if the Jaguars offense really moves the ball down the field? All of a sudden, Leonard Fournette is a league-winning running back. Hold or sell David Johnson. I don't know if you guys watched that Cardinals-Bucks game on Sunday, but David Johnson, as I talked about in my column this week, David Johnson looked like he was running in wet cement. And I talked about this last week on the podcast, but I don't think David Johnson has looked all that great as a runner all season long. We've just really seen it highlighted, I feel like, of late because Kenyon Drake is this really athletic running back. You know, sometimes in fantasy football, you have to sell low. And that's sort of what we're looking at with David Johnson right now. In Week 10, Kenyon Drake out-attempted Johnson 10-5. He saw 7 targets to David Johnson's 1. And he played 15 more snaps. And flat out, you guys, Kenyon Drake was the better running back versus David Johnson, and it wasn't close. So if someone in your league still believes Johnson is this locked-in RB2 from here on out, you can sell David Johnson. If not, there's probably not a reason to let David Johnson go because we do know that David Johnson has some upside, especially as a receiver. So if you're holding on to David Johnson, that means that you're holding on to hope that his performance on Sunday had to do with his injury and just getting acclimated to the football field again. That's why he was so ineffective. I'm not that confident that that's the reason why, but that's the hope that you have to hold on to. Add Darius Slayton. No Sterling Shepard, no Evan Ingram. Darius Slayton went bonkers. He played 93% of New York snaps. He saw almost 38% of the team's targets, and he turned that into a 10-catch, 121-yard, 2-touchdown performance. There are still question marks surrounding Sterling Shepard and Evan Ingram, so Darius Slayton should be added off the waiver wire this week. Buy Alvin Kamara. So the Saints offense really underperformed in Week 10. It was probably the most shocking performance by an offense all season long. But Alvin Kamara did still come through in PPR formats with a decent performance. He finishes a top 12 RB1. Entering this game, there were some question marks about his potential usage given how Latavius Murray played while Alvin Kamara was sidelined. But Kamara played 78.3% of New Orleans' offensive snaps, which was his second highest rate of the season. His running back rush share was the lowest of the year at 44.4%, but he saw a 23% target share. That's a really good number. That's right in line with what he was seeing the last time he was healthy. So in other words, if New Orleans' offense had performed, I think Kamara likely would have been a high-end RB1 this past week. The scoring opportunities just weren't there, but the peripheral numbers absolutely were. And I think that Alvin Kamara can give you solid numbers down the stretch. And there are plenty of people out there who are very worried about Latavius Murray. And I think it's understandable. But even with Murray playing a role like we saw with Mark Ingram in years past, Kamara can still produce higher-end RB1 numbers in this offense. And keep in mind, you guys, Kamara is a positive touchdown regression candidate. Based on his rushing and receiving yardage totals, he should have 2.3 more touchdowns than he currently has. Add Brian Hill. So in that same game between the Saints and the Falcons, Devontae Freeman exited with a foot injury. That left the backfield to Brian Hill. Hill ended the game playing over half of Atlanta's snaps, and he had 64.5% of the team's running back attempts. Those are both really strong numbers. Now, the Falcons' backfield hasn't been all that great for fantasy this year. They ranked 26th in points per game as a team, but any running back with a chance to see touches deserves to be rostered. Hold or buy Odell Beckham. A lot of you hit me up this past week asking what the heck to do with Odell Beckham. And I think that the answer to this is kind of boring, because it depends. I do think that selling him right now would be selling him at a low point. And yes, I do believe that this is a low point. Beckham hasn't scored since week 2, even though he's averaging nearly 9 targets per game and a 26.4% target share. He should have more touchdowns than he currently has. But I do think that the schedule in the short term is a little bit worrisome because Cleveland gets Pittsburgh in 2 of their next 3 games. Pittsburgh's defense has been very strong since they got Minkah Fitzpatrick. They've allowed just 2 top 24 wide receiver 2 performances over this time. That's since week 3. So that's not a cake matchup, and we know that the Steelers can generate pressure as well. But if you want to look further into the future, if you want to look into the fantasy playoffs, for instance, or as we inch towards the fantasy playoffs, Cleveland still gets Miami, Arizona, and Cincinnati. Those are 3 very beatable defenses. So that's why if you need to win in the short term, Odell Beckham probably is more of a hold. But if you're looking down the stretch and into the playoffs, Odell Beckham might be a buy. Add Kalen Ballage. So we have a 1-game sample now of this Dolphins backfield without Kenyon Drake and Mark Walton. And in that game, Kalen Ballage saw a lot of work. He played 81.8% of the team's snaps. That's great, hooray. But he also saw 20 carries and ran for 43 rushing yards. And then he had 2 receiving yards on 4 receptions. Now, I've talked about this before, but I don't think Kalen Ballage is that good of a running back. And if he continues to play like this, he might lose his job. So that's why Myles Gaskin should be on your radar as we approach the end of the season. But Kalen Ballage should be rostered right now given this workload. That snap rate is really high. Sell Austin Eckler. So those of you with Austin Eckler who have been starting him over the last few weeks, you know that you've been pretty lucky. He's ranked outside the top 15 in weekly running back scoring in each of the last 3 games, and that's while finding the end zone twice. Without those touchdowns, he'd be in trouble. And he only has 9 total targets over this time. And the problem is the Chargers are getting Melvin Gordon more and more involved. That's hurting Austin Eckler. Eckler's failed to reach a 50% snap share in each of his last 2, and over his last 3, his target share has hovered around the 10% mark. It was almost double that during the first 7 weeks of the season. Now, I do think Eckler is going to be usable in PPR leagues, especially if and when the Chargers are trailing. And that could happen this week. They're facing the Chiefs. So maybe like Derrick Henry last week, selling Austin Eckler right now isn't the best idea. But what happens if Austin Eckler doesn't perform? It's a great matchup for him, but if he doesn't do well, all of a sudden Austin Eckler is even harder to sell. So I really wanted to make this transaction to say that Austin Eckler is trending in the wrong direction. Things can turn around quickly because he's a really good football player, but things aren't trending right for Austin Eckler. Add Deebo Samuel. So things were looking good for Deebo Samuel actually entering Week 10's contest against Seattle. I actually talked about him on last week's matchup show. But during his 3 games leading up to that game against the Seahawks, he had seen at least a 14% target share in each of those contests while running the second most wide receiver routes for the 49ers behind only Emmanuel Sanders. Well, Emmanuel Sanders left Monday night's game with an injury, which allowed Deebo Samuel to have a very big game. He caught 8 passes for 112 yards. So if Emmanuel Sanders misses time, Deebo Samuel could become a decent wide receiver for your fantasy squad. Even if Emmanuel Sanders is back, I would be stashing Deebo Samuel. Buy Chris Godwin. So after finishing with 4 top 6 performances across the first 6 weeks of the season and looking like a true league-winning wide receiver, Chris Godwin has ranked outside the top 20 in weekly wide receiver scoring in each of his last 3 games. But I'm not that concerned. He's hit a 20% target share in each of those contests, and he's got a pair of targets from within the 10-yard line during that span as well. Mike Evans has 4. Mike Evans has been the better fantasy asset, but Chris Godwin has still been fine. And I think that Godwin and Mike Evans could be really intriguing fantasy playoff wide receivers as well. The Buccaneers faced the Lions and the Texans in weeks 15 and 16. Both of those teams have surrendered top 10 numbers to wide receivers this season in PPR leagues. Add Kyle Allen. So if Derek Carr is on your waiver wire, I think Derek Carr would be the best streaming option for you this week. But he's rostered in 45% of Yahoo leagues, which makes Kyle Allen a viable option. Allen's at home this week. He's going up against Atlanta, who was good in week 10, but over the larger sample size, they've kind of not been very good. They've allowed the 6th most fantasy points to opposing passers this year. They're giving up the 4th highest yards per attempt rate, and only 4 teams have generated quarterback pressure at a lower rate than the Falcons. And opposing quarterbacks are averaging over 5 fantasy points per game above expectation when they face Atlanta. FanDuel Sportsbook has the Falcons-Panthers game this week at a 50.5 point over-under, and Carolina is a 6.5 point favorite. So that gives the Panthers a nice implied team total, which really boosts the value of Kyle Allen as a streaming option. Add the Oakland Raiders defense. The Raiders are at home this week. They're double-digit favorites, and they're facing a Bengals team that's allowed opposing defenses to rank in the top 10 in weekly scoring during 6 of 9 games played this year. Oakland's been bad at getting the quarterback this year. They're dead last in pressure rate. They're 10th worst in sack rate, but it's the right matchup for a streaming defense to thrive. So you can absolutely pick them up and use them. The 16 transaction that you can't get in my weekly 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com this week is one that you've heard before, but it's to sell Aaron Jones. Now let me explain. Aaron Jones should be an RB1 from here on out. I think I said as much the last time that I talked about selling Jones. He's performed basically in his own tier behind Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook though. And his fantasy points per game right now, which is 21.1 in PPR formats, I don't think he'll be able to continue at that pace. Let's begin with the obvious place to start, and that's touchdown regression. He scored 3 more times this past week, and now, based on his yardage total, he has over 8 more touchdowns than he should have. Again, you guys know by now that context is needed. It's necessary. But even when you provide some of that context, he's overperforming. For instance, ESPN.com Mike Clay's opportunity-adjusted touchdown metric, or OTD, still had Jones with 5.2 more touchdowns than he should have entering week 10. And considering he scored 3 more times, that number's only going to skyrocket. So okay, cool. He shouldn't be scoring at this high of a rate. But there's more actually. Jones only played half of Green Bay's snaps on Sunday. He didn't see a single target. We'll see if that receiving workload is some sort of trend or not, but scoring at this high of a rate while also not playing workhorse type snaps is a big red flag. And then there's the fact that they have a bye this week, and then they'll face San Francisco when they're off of their bye. So if you have Aaron Jones and you absolutely need a win, now would be the time to sell in order to win in the short term. You know, it's such a bizarre feeling talking about Aaron Jones in this way, since I was so into him when he was coming out of the draft. And this podcast became an Aaron Jones truther podcast. It still is. But to come full circle, like I said at the top, I'm just looking at the information in front of me and explaining what it says. He may end up as the RB3 this year, but there's plenty of reason to believe that he's going to produce more like a mid-range to a lower-end one from here on out. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow with the weekly 10 Trend Show.